Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Kneindyk. I'm the president of Refugees International. And on behalf of RI and our co-hosts for this event, ECDC, Amnesty International, and the New Lines Institute, I'm really pleased to welcome you this morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone, to this really important, really timely event on the 5-year anniversary of the war in Tigray. So 5 years ago, the brutal war in Tigray began, and it went on to take hundreds of thousands of lives and displace millions of people. An absolutely horrific war marked by a wide range of grave human rights abuses, extreme sexual violence, abductions, arbitrary detentions, and torture. And aid was often blocked as well in Tigray during this conflict, leading to a lot of starvation, the deterioration of the health system, and other infrastructure that was decimated by the war. 3 years ago, the Pretoria Agreement brought an end to the main fighting. However, its provisions have still not been fully upheld. And as a result, many in Tigray are still struggling today, where the region ought to now be in a post-war recovery and rebuilding period. Instead, many Tigrayans are still barely surviving. Aid is still falling short, especially following the aid cuts earlier this year around the world. And many IDPs are still unable to return home. Many schools are still closed because they are occupied by IDPs who have not yet been able to return. And so that is also disrupting childhood education. And deaths due to starvation are being increasingly reported, as are malnutrition rates growing more and more severe. And this is all creating a risk that tensions will escalate as people await a genuine peace dividend years after the war nominally ended. So as you will hear today, the Pretoria Agreement badly needs to be enforced and upheld, and the region of Tigray needs much more support to rebuild. So we, Refugees International, Amnesty, the New Lines Institute, and ECDC, along with other partners who've helped organize this webinar and support this webinar today, have not forgotten about the conflict in Tigray or the importance of upholding the Pretoria Agreement. And we're thankful to others who have not forgotten either. In a moment, you'll hear from a really distinguished panel moderated by PBS NewsHour's Nick Schifrin, who we're really thrilled to have with us today. He will introduce the panel, and then you'll hear from them about some of the current challenges and concerns facing the region, and pointing to hopefully possible ways forward. But now, first, I'm really pleased to introduce Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, who represents California's 51st Congressional District and serves as the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa. She also has a very long and deep commitment and experience on humanitarian issues, having worked at the UN, UNICEF, and the State Department. Representative Jacobs has shown a deep commitment to shining a light on places like Tigray and pushing the United States government and other actors around the world to work seriously towards improved civilian protection, peace, and the full implementation of the Pretoria Agreement. So it's my real pleasure to thank her for joining us today. It's a testament to your commitment on these issues, which we so deeply appreciate, and I'm honored to give you the floor. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. And hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you. Thank you for this very timely and important event. And thank you to Amnesty International, ECDC, Human Rights Watch, New Lines Institute, Open Society Foundation, and Refugees International for convening this discussion. This week marks 3 years since the signing of the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement in Pretoria between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, and 5 years since the war started. And while the height of the violence and atrocities in Tigray may be behind us, durable peace still remains out of reach, especially when the consequences of war are still a daily reality. People in the region continue to suffer from emergency-level malnutrition, so families may skip meals and rely on very weak food supplies. Children face stunted growth, and pregnant and breastfeeding women are at a high risk for complications. Hundreds of thousands of children are out of school, and many children spend their days helping parents secure food or water or wander in camps. And there's still a dysfunctional health system. The World Health Organization reports that only about 3% of health facilities in Tigray are fully functioning. Healthcare workers are hemorrhaging supplies, leading to reduced treatment for non-communicable diseases, maternal and child health services, more complications, and more deaths. And on top of this, the key provisions of the Pretoria Agreement remain unfulfilled. Over 1 million people displaced from Tigray during the war have still not been able to return. Transitional justice remains elusive, and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of TPLF combatants has not happened. These aren't just unfulfilled promises. These are key ingredients to preventing the resurgence of more conflict and violence across the country. And meanwhile, we're seeing escalating violence and human rights violations in Amhara and Oromia, while escalating tensions with Eritrea over control of the Assab threaten to disrupt the fragile peace in the region. I delivered remarks during last year's event, and it's disappointing that so much of the stalled progress remains the same. Ethiopia represents the future of the African continent, and it's the second most populous African country. It has the potential to be a stabilizing force for the region and across the continent. But we can't get there until and unless we address the drivers of instability, including ensuring accountability and reconciliation among Ethiopians. That's why I'm urging the Trump administration to not only focus its attention on Ethiopia, but to actually invest in its Africa team so it has the bandwidth to do so. That means, for instance, nominating an assistant secretary for Africa at the State Department, hiring a senior director for Africa at the National Security Council, and considering the appointment of a new special envoy for the Horn of Africa. There needs to be consistent engagement with the government of Ethiopia about the implementation of the Pretoria Agreement and the need to calm tensions with Eritrea. So I'm grateful for today's conversation and look forward to hearing the expert perspectives and recommendations from our impressive panel today. Thank you all so much. It's an honor to be doing this work alongside all of you.
So Nick, I think we'll hand off now to you to get us into the panel.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And thank you, Representative Jacobs. Really appreciate it. And welcome everyone who joins us online. We just went through quite a few of the challenges facing Ethiopia and Tigray coming up in the future. What I'd like to do is structure this talk across three main subjects. One is we're going to look back a little bit, take stock of Pretoria 3 years later. We're going to look at the present, examine the risks of renewed conflict, which were just laid out, obviously. And then we're going to do what everybody who throws peanuts does, give some advice to the Trump administration and to Washington about how to create a sustainable peace. And so it's a great honor to talk about all three of those topics with a fabulous panel, and hopefully everybody can see everybody. And if everyone can unmute as I introduce you guys, Peyton Knopf is Special Advisor to the Dialogue Advisory Group and former Deputy Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa. Peyton, thanks very much. Tadale Lema is the founder and former editor-in-chief of Addis Standard Publications, a leading independent media in Ethiopia. Tadale, welcome. And Mike Woldemariam is an associate professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. So it's about 9:40. I'll probably try and go till about 10:30 or so. So we'll take about 45 minutes, structure the talk in the order that I just said, and then we'll hand it over. So please send us your questions. You should be able to do that in the question and answer form in Zoom. So Peyton Knopf, let's start with you. So as we've been saying, the government of Ethiopia and the TPLF signed the Pretoria Agreement exactly 3 years ago, signed, 2 days ago, 3 years ago, and implemented or began to be implemented yesterday, 3 days ago. Take stock of those last 3 years. Do you think the Pretoria set a new baseline in that conflicts can, in fact, be resolved through dialogue?
Thanks, Nick, very much, and thanks to the organizers for bringing this event together, because as Jeremy said at the outset, I think it is very, very timely, given some of the challenges, significant challenges that remain. And Nick, you took the words right out of my mouth. I think one of the important legacies of Pretoria that is worth not losing sight of despite some of the risks that remain, is the fact that it did create a new baseline for the fact that conflicts in Ethiopia can in fact be resolved through dialogue and not military force. And when I contrast where we are now, again, in a moment that is very, very fragile and fraught with risk, with where we were in the run-up to the war in Tigray in 2020, on the positive side of the ledger, there's far more attention being paid to the risks of conflict and far more effort. And this event in and of itself is emblematic of the kind of attention that's being devoted to some of those challenges. In 2020, what we saw actually was active denial of a lot of the warning signs, including, I must say, by the US government, both career officials and political leadership in the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, that frankly you don't see now. The risk of renewed conflict is an open topic of conversation, and without overstating it, I think that's very important. And secondly, and related to your question, when the war in Tigray began in 2020, there was a lot of, if I can call it, diplomatic complicity with the notion that somehow the war would be quick, decisive, and that military victory was possible. And I think what Pretoria has done, has demonstrated rather successfully, is that, one, I mean, the war demonstrated quite blatantly that it was not decisive, that it was very bloody, as everyone has said. And what Pretoria affirmed was that actually there is a way of resolving political issues through political means. And so I think that, for me at least, remains the North Star as we discuss some of the challenges going forward.
For those of you who watch PBS NewsHour, you will know in advance that I try and bring out people's disagreements. This panel does have a few agreements, but I will try my best to highlight some of the disagreements. And Sadale, I wonder if you could jump in here. Do you see Pretoria 3 years later as a baseline to create a momentum that conflicts can be resolved through dialogue? Is it more, or is it more of a framework that is more of an unfulfilled piece?
It's difficult to disagree with Peyton on this. I know that he has deeply been involved within having a resolution to this conflict, to this war, a devastating war, as it were. And I agree with him that there was, at the surface level, a baseline that the Pretoria Agreement brought in, and that it is worth trying to bring the two warring parties together in the same room and have a discussion, no matter how impossible it looked like at the time. However, I think I'll be very careful to flag this one as a baseline in which ending a devastating war like this could be emulated elsewhere, because what Pretoria has done, it simply largely functioned as a framework of intent rather than a realized peace. Yes, it succeeded in silencing the guns in Tigray, but not the fundamental cause of the war in and of itself. And in fact, it has further complicated the failure to follow through. The Pretoria Agreement has further complicated the situation on the ground in a way that any kind of Pretoria 2 may not be responding to that. Most importantly, Pretoria was negligent in its approach to accountability and justice. And that, to my understanding, is what is festering, what we are seeing on the ground today. Because if you look into the actors, the stakeholders that are still playing and teetering into yet another conflict in the region are the same people. People who should have belonged to the ICC are making a call today to, threatening for another conflict. So Pretoria's failure in upholding the accountability and justice matter, and coming down to just one area, which is disarmament issues, focusing on that one, and the lack of follow through, the lack of ownership and guarantors, does not give one a confidence that this is a baseline, something that can be, emulated to address complicated conflicts such as the one that Ethiopia is confronted with. So while it silences the guns, I agree with Python there, it's not something that we could confidently say that it was something successful. Nick?
Mike Waldemarian, I wonder if you could take stock of Pretoria 3 years later and let me point you in a direction. Do the TPLF and the Ethiopian government feel as though the commitments are being upheld?
Well, again, thanks to all for hosting this conversation. I think many of the points that Sadala and Peyton have made are right on the money. I think Pretoria is a bit of a mixed bag at the moment, right? I think the agreement at this point is at risk of unraveling. And we, I think at this point are staring down a potential conflict in northern Ethiopia, an internationalized conflict in the way the first one was, involving Eritrea and perhaps some other parties. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think the agreement itself, Pretoria itself, which is actually two separate agreements. There was an agreement in Pretoria, there was a follow-on agreement in Nairobi, suffers from some structural weaknesses. I mean, ambiguous in certain places. I think the monitoring verification mechanisms are not particularly strong. But as a result, I think both sides feel as if the other has not really abided by what they see as core commitments under Pretoria. Sadala mentioned the demobilization question. I think that's relevant. There's the issue of territorial disputes, right? I mean, Tigray's expectation, or the expectation of Tigrayan leadership, was the restoration of Tigray's pre-war boundaries. That has not happened. There's also the question of the TPLF's re-registration as a political party and Tigray's broader reintegration into kind of national institutions. I mean, these are areas where, again, each side feels like commitments have not been abided by. But again, having said all that, and I think this is where Peyton started, Pretoria did, particularly in its first year or two, achieve quite a bit, right? When the agreement was struck in November 2022, the war was entering a particularly dangerous chapter, right? Territory was quickly changing hands. There was a risk of another sort of round of mass atrocities, big famine risks. That was all stopped, right, at a particularly opportune time. Relief flowed into the region, not enough, but a significant amount, a return of core public services. And then subsequent to that, both sides did implement, I think, some pretty difficult and what I thought would be very challenging aspects of Pretoria. There was some demobilization of heavy weapons. Federal forces were allowed to move into Mekelle by the TPLF. There was a terrorism delisting. We could go down a bunch of different things, right? So I think, to sort of sum it all up, I think we're in a difficult place right now for the reasons I mentioned, but there was, I think some initial successes. And I'll just add, this was alluded to, Ethiopia doesn't really have a history of resolving its major armed conflicts through negotiated settlement. And that's what this was at a base level. Usually it's a military victory or the co-optation of one force or another. But this, I think this in that level, I think broke new ground. The question is now, how do we consolidate this?
Absolutely. So let's go to that question. How do we consolidate? And let's spend a little bit of time talking about the present. And then, like I said, we'll get to some policy prescriptions at the end of this conversation. So Peyton, let's start with you. You were messaging me this before. Are all the sides today overestimating their own capacities? And if so, what is the risk of that?
I think there's significant risks, and I hope in my opening comments I didn't minimize that, because I think one of the reasons this discussion is so valuable and timely is precisely because the risks are tremendous, and the implications of an Ethiopia-Eritrea war, let's just say it, would extend far beyond Tigray. And as I said earlier, I mean, despite professions in advance of the war in Tigray and in the early stages of the war in Tigray in 2020 that would be quick and decisive, you hear a similar logic from parties concerned now, in the sense that if a war were to erupt between Ethiopia and Eritrea, Tigray, one side or another of that somehow there would be a swift victory. I see no evidence to suggest that that's the case. If anything, my view is that it would be ever more catastrophic than the war that we saw, that began rather in 2020. And so precisely because there is this tendency, it's not unique to Ethiopia or to Eritrea or to Northeast Africa, it happens in many conflicts, where various protagonists overestimate their own capacities and underestimate the capacities of their opponents. And that's can be a very lethal mix. I sit in Nairobi these days, and I will say that it is certainly, when I talk to folks in the region, I mean, senior government officials, etc., it is one of the top issues they raise in terms of their concern of an interstate war, to use Tsadale's phrase, and the prospects of that. And so I think that that challenges all of us to think very creatively about what can be done to prevent that worst case scenario. And as I said, I mean, I think all hope is not lost, right? I mean, there is certainly significant instability in Ethiopia. There, God knows, are longstanding challenges between Ethiopia and Eritrea. There remains a lot of volatility in the Tigrayan internal political scene, and that should all be very sobering. Having said that, war is not inevitable, in my view. All concerned have agency and choices to prevent a conflict. And I am encouraged by the degree of international attention broadly focused on the risks, by the attention, I'm not predisposed to compliment the Trump administration, as anyone who knows me will attest, but I am pleasantly surprised by the contrast and the energy and focus that the administration is giving actually to the risk of conflict, and making clear that the United States does not want to see a war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, wants to see implementation of the Pretoria Agreement, and is committed to trying to shepherd a diplomatic initiative to prevent some of the more dire scenarios that I think we're discussing. So no, I think the risks are tremendous, and I think it challenges all of us to continue to devote attention and not avert our eyes in a world of which obviously has no shortage of conflicts, but this could far surpass a lot of the other ones that I think we see, sadly, unfolding in other parts of the globe.
So Tsadale, take us through a point that we were talking about the other day, but before we get to what can be done to prevent further war, even regional war, do you fear that we're witnessing some of the same elements locally that we witnessed ahead of 2020, and why?
Thank you, Nick. This is a very important question because for me, it's like being in a loop. In the run-up to the outbreak of the war in November 2020, and now I was listening to the Army Chief of Staff yesterday, and he launched such a blistering criticism of the TPLF, what he said are like a criminal clique within the TPLF. And he is very clear that if it comes to defending the country's interest, in his own word, war is not something that they would rule out. And the rhetoric that we are seeing today, both in the media and in the local authorities, there was another similar kind of talk that has everybody nervous from Tigray, one senior general in Tigray last week, that the preparation that they are doing. It is a déjà vu. The feeling is a déjà vu. But the one thing that I sometimes look into to not feel, bad about it is there is a clear indication from the Tigrayan authority side that they don't have an interest in re-engaging in war again. But given that in such a combustible circumstance, what all it takes is for one soldier to misfire, for everything to unravel in this very tense circumstance. It is very difficult to stay optimistic about that. So the similarities of the run-up to the war, and now the rhetoric in the media and the authorities' assertion that something has to be eliminated. The army general was saying yesterday, this very criminal clique within the TPLF must be eliminated. These are his words, right? This is exactly the same word that the prime minister was saying over and again prior to the war in 2020, that he unless they are eliminated, Ethiopia will not be at peace. So once you get into that kind of political reconfiguration, you would not back down unless you follow through what it means to be eliminating the person that you or the group that you have designated as being a criminal clique, right? So there is that similarity, one. And the other is the Ethiopian authorities are very much convinced that the Eritrean regime which was in bed with them during the atrocities that they committed together in the Tigray region, are now at odds with them. And they're very convinced that the Eritrean regime is supporting Mekelle and also the armed group in the Amhara region. And there has not been any consolidated intelligence report about that, but everybody is saying that. This was exactly the same thing that they were saying about the TPLF in the run-up to 2020, when they were blaming the TPLF of arming internal violent groups in the region in Ethiopia. So similarities are eerie. They're very similar. And the media is echoing the same over and over again. So I see that similarity, and that keeps me up at night, if you ask me, Nick.
So Mike, take that last point and expand on it. Talk about the region. Do you feel, well, the alliance, we don't have the same necessary ingredients on the alliances that we had 5 years ago. So explain that a little bit. But that last point that Tsadal made of the fears of today's actions, the ingredients being the same, expand that out to the region. What do you see when you look beyond the local issues into whether the ingredients are there for a more regional conflict?
Yeah, sure. I'll take the regional piece in a moment, maybe just reflecting on the parallels between, November 2020 and today in terms of the risks of conflict. I think there are a lot of parallels, absolutely. But I also think, when you sort of move beyond some of the rhetoric and posturing from the various sides, I do think there is a recognition amongst all concerned that the outcome of a conflict in northern Ethiopia, an internationalized conflict in northern Ethiopia, is wildly uncertain, very difficult to predict. And you certainly look back to the trajectory of the Tigray conflict, right, between 2020 and 2022, the wild swings that were involved. I don't think any side of that conflict predicted how that exactly would shake out, right? And I think that uncertainty has been a brake on conflict thus far, right? But when troops are being mobilized, when the rhetoric is going through the roof, the risk of a sort of inadvertent escalation, a miscalculation, I think, is quite high. And that's sort of how I think about the conflict risks at this point in time. In terms of the regional picture, look, I think it is quite likely that any conflict in northern Ethiopia between the federal government and the TPLF, components of the TPLF, will not be contained in Tigray. It will likely spread into adjoining regions, Amhara, Afar, as it did in the previous conflict. And of course, the Amhara region is in its own turmoil, political turmoil at the moment. It will also have, I think, implications for the security situation in Oromia, right? As if the federal government were to move assets to the north, that would create, I think, a vacuum in Oromia that would be quite considerable. And then you have the Eritrea factor, right? And I think something that has not been mentioned, look, Eritrea-Ethiopia relations have been deteriorating really since the Pretoria Agreement, actually before the Pretoria Agreement. Both the Eritrean and Ethiopian governments had disagreements about Pretoria. I think the Eritrean government broadly was not a fan of that particular agreement. That in conjunction with Ethiopia, the prime minister's sort of port agenda, Red Sea agenda, which appears to be targeting the Eritrean port of Asab, I think have further worsened relations. And so in that context, the Eritrean government has executed a kind of informal rapprochement, if you will, with a particular component of the TPLF. As a kind of deterrent or a kind of tool in the event of conflict, right? And it's not only in Tigray that the Eritrean government has pursued this kind of approach. I think there are signs that and again, as Tsadal noted, the intel on this is not, it's not clear, but we think they're doing this on Amhara region. There is a kind of proxy maneuvering between the federal government and the Eritrean government in the Afar region as well. And I think the goal of the Eritrean government is that if it comes to conflict, if it is about the Red Sea, then the conflict, in their view, should, if they can, should be kept in Ethiopia, right? By activating these alliance partners, if you will. Now, of course, from the Ethiopian government's perspective, this is all quite dangerous, right? And for them, Eritrean involvement in Ethiopia, but particularly Tigray, is a red line, right? Moving outside of the Eritrea factor, it's quite possible, I would say likely, that a war in northern Ethiopia, possibly involving Eritrea, would spread into Sudan and merge with the Sudanese civil war. The Eritrean government is close and a big supporter of the Sudanese armed forces in Sudan, particularly in eastern Sudan, but also beyond. There are reports that TPLF soldiers are also kind of on side with those actors in Sudan as well. So you could quite quickly see all of that sort of merging together in a particularly catastrophic way. There are other actors, external actors we could talk about, but I think those are the main regional pieces.
Yeah, no, and that is a catastrophe for the region if that were to happen, certainly. Peyton, pick up on one of Mike's points about inadvertent escalation. I wonder if you agree with that and how that would look and whether that is one of the main risks today.
I know you're hunting for disagreements, so I'm sorry to disappoint you, Nick, but I do agree with that. And I maybe would take it a step further, which is that I think, external actors that want to destabilize Ethiopia from within have to have accomplices in that pursuit, right? And one of the ways, and maybe this sort of segues to kind of what can be done in this environment that we're in this context we're discussing is.
Well, we've got plenty of time for that, so
yeah,
keep
very good.
But
just to say that I think the more effort that is devoted to helping Ethiopia come to peace with itself, the less room to maneuver, and I think Sadala and Mike were both alluding to this as well, the less room to maneuver there is for those outside Ethiopia to pursue their own agendas inside the country, right? And that is true inside Tigray. I mean, we've been talking about the volatile political situation there, but it's also true in other parts of the region. And again, without sounding sort of overly sort of boosterish for the Pretoria Agreement, I do think Pretoria was a step in the direction of demonstrating that dialogue can be successful. And I am old enough to know, having spent a lot of time personally and with a number of other colleagues, beating our heads against the wall in the course of the Tigray War to persuade folks to have negotiations for months and months and months and months, during which they refused. But then they did negotiate in the end, right? And Sadala is, of course, right. Each of these contexts are very different, but I don't believe that it is a pipe dream. And I don't believe that it is too late to diffuse some of the internal tensions inside Ethiopia, as difficult and as longstanding as they may be, in the interest of then heading off a broader regional conflagration, as Mike was elaborating in his comments.
So, Dale, is it a pipe dream? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. There are a couple of things that must happen if we really want to see even a fraction of the Pretoria Agreement to come into fruition, any level of fruition. Because in my understanding, and I'm sorry, Peyton, for that, in my understanding, what Pretoria, despite it is huge success in silencing the guns, is it has created an alternative reality in which Tigray regional state is held in this perpetual state of exceptionalism. And what do I mean by that? Other than what I said earlier of the lack of accountability that is breeding and threatening for a renewal of another conflict yet, it has created the war in the Amhara region. It's directly responsible for the ignition of the war, even though the tension was already there politically. These are parties that came together, that have signed an alliance of war pact against the Tigray region. And when a peace was agreed, it was very obvious that the war pact was going to unravel. So what we have seen is a war in the Amhara region, the exit of which nobody is talking about today. And there has also been no attempt at institutionalizing and establishing an implementation mechanism with timelines and verifications and all. Yes, there was the African Union Monitoring and Verification and Compliance Mission, which was reporting in the initial phases, as Mike was saying earlier, about the disarmament efforts of that. But other than that, there was no attempt. In a sense, Pretoria did not have a guarantor. There were mediators, the US government, IGAD, the African Union, and the EU. These are mediators that facilitated the conversation, but nobody took responsibility of becoming a guarantor of that. And without a guarantor of a peace agreement, without a follow-through, an institutionalized follow-through, it is obvious that it was going to unravel. And what we're seeing today is the unraveling of that. There is also no attention being given about recentering political dialogue, because that is essentially at the root cause of this war. It is a political difference there. And there is no attempt in given. They have done 3-4 follow-ups as a political dialogue so far, but that is what the EU statement yesterday was saying, like start or re-engage in political dialogue again. And there is none, because so far Tigray has neither been reintegrated to the region, to the federation constitutionally, or its political fragmentation does not have any mechanism for political dialogue, because it just doesn't exist. So I think without balancing this, without having a renewed diplomacy that balances this with accountability, Pretoria is really nothing other than breeding further conflicts, be it with Asmara Mekelle or Asmara Addis or Mekelle Bahir Dar. It is really nothing if we don't do this.
Let me go out of order a little bit. Peyton, you want to respond to that?
No. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think there is no substitute for political dialogue, and the sort of Rubik's Cube. I mean, Sabella, you know this far better than I do, and many others. I mean, the Rubik's Cube of Ethiopian politics is a very complicated one, right? And is, I mean, that you cited example of Amhara region, too often, at least in my albeit limited experience, seen as a zero-sum game, right? So what we're talking about is, challenge upon challenge upon challenge compounding over years and decades, right? That needs to be unraveled. And that's not an easy task. And I don't mean to oversimplify it. And I certainly don't mean to minimize either the difficulty or the risks of it. But I fully agree that the way of at least starting to try to unravel the Gordian knot is to expedite, elevate, and press for and encourage, as you mentioned, the EU and others have done, certainly the United States, to do that through dialogue. The notion that any of these are going to be resolved, I mean, the sort of big fundamental questions of the Ethiopian state are going to be resolved through, insurgencies or an interstate war is, just a recipe for disaster in the end, right? And so that's what I'm sort of trying to continue to push for, as maybe naive as it may sound on occasion.
Mike, jump in here, and Tzadala's argument at the end there was that not only is there no political agreement, there's not even political dialogue or a mechanism for it. Why don't you jump on that and comment on that?
Yep. I mean, political dialogue is obviously necessary. I think it's the only route forward. And indeed, Pretoria was quite explicit on this front about the need for kind of a long-term dialogue between Tigrayan authorities, the TPLF, and the federal government on a range of issues. But I do think, Tzadala's point, and I think, Peyton would agree, there has to be an active diplomatic coalition, right, to actually push that dialogue forward. And we have to keep in mind how we actually got to the Pretoria Agreement, right? It was a coalition between the AU, key AU member states, the Kenyans, I think, played a role, the South Africans, and a push by the United States to actually, create the diplomatic energy and the focus to bring the parties to Pretoria and actually consolidate this, or not consolidate, but reach an actual agreement. And I wonder, is that coalition still in existence at this point in time, right? Working in concert to push the parties forward. I think that coalition needs to be rehabilitated, right? And it needs to, I think, get back to work on this issue and think about the kinds of security guarantees, the kinds of financial commitments and incentives that can be used to kind of grease the wheels of Pretoria and get it back on track. The other piece of this, and this is not something we've talked about, is the role of other extra-regional actors, particularly in the Middle East. Everyone is aware, obviously, about events unfolding in Sudan. I think one of the key policy questions there is how can the United States and other concerned actors kind of mitigate or manage the role of Middle Eastern powers that are on various sides of the conflict, kind of fueling hostilities. I think that is also a question that is relevant to the Ethiopian conflict, right? Because in the event of a conflict, different sides of it, right, are going to try and mobilize the contending coalitions in Sudan, external coalitions, right? Whether it's the UAE, whether it's Egypt. And so, as we work through a kind of African mechanism to address this, to de-escalate tensions in northern Ethiopia, we also have to keep in mind the broader extra-regional picture and kind of managing the influence of some of those actors. That to me is a very key question.
No, absolutely. And I think we'll come back to that because we do have some time now to talk about policy prescriptions, because I think that's the obvious segue here. So let's go back. Peyton, you were talking about this a little earlier, but let's start with you. So we're looking at the steps that Washington can take to support sustainable peace. So talk about that. And to Mike's point, is there a coalition that exists out there that might help push?
I think it's important that Mike put it on the table, and he's certainly right about the history, right? I mean, obviously, the United States did play an instrumental role, but it was not a unilateral role in bringing Pretoria into being. And I mean, for example, President Kenyatta and others were instrumental in closing the deal, as it were. And so I do think, I mean, again, I'm struck by the number of conversations I have where senior folks throughout the region, and I mean, certainly in Washington and Europe as well, but in the immediate region, the degree of concern they raise about the risks and what they see, is the impact on their own interests, whether they're in Kenya or some, other sort of quote unquote frontline states. And so I do think, I would like to think that could be catalyzed into a more concerted effort to prevent some of the scenarios we're discussing. I think Mike also raises another important point, if I may, which is that we need to look at this absolutely in the regional context, right? I mean, I may look young, but I've worked on Horn of Africa for, 20, 25 years. Others have worked on it longer, God knows. But this is about as bad as I've ever seen the region, the worst state I've seen the region in, not just because of Sudan, but because of some of the other issues we've talked about. And this is a region, as everyone, Mike and Sadala know very well, that is prone to secessionist movements. And this is a region that is not, and increasingly even less committed as time goes on, to the notion of sovereignty and to the notion of territorial unity and integrity and to the notion of sacrosanct borders. And some of these fundamental norms, my view is, need to be front and center in terms of any diplomatic effort, because despite all of the challenges within states, we at least need to stand by the principle of the fact that borders matter, that states are in fact sovereign, that there's not a right to seize territory, to mount an aggressive campaign one way or another, either through proxies or overtly in this region. And that is, I think, a platform, for lack of a better word, that a sort of diplomatic coalition, to take Mike's phrase, is well suited to advance and sort of draw a line in the sand in terms of what is acceptable to not acceptable. And I think that's been done to some extent, right? I don't want to make it sound as if certainly the United States and I think others have conveyed in very strong terms their firm belief that there should not be a war between Eritrea, that military means is not the way to pursue access to the sea, for example. But that needs to be an ongoing, sustained, effort built, as Mike said, on a coalition that ensures that the sort of the better angels, as it were, prevail in the various capitals as they weigh their next steps.
Better angels and line in the sand, but not a red line. We no longer draw red lines. So Tadali, I want you to focus on what steps Washington can take. And you've been making this point that Pretoria had no guarantor. So do you think that the U.S., with the EU and the AU, cannot see themselves as arbiters, but instead as guarantors? And if so, what does that look like?
Thank you, Nick. It looks like taking a step back to how it was signed and to revisit what are the provisions included in the Pretoria Agreement? Because right now, even that is blurred. It has just it was lost in the details over the past 3 years. I think a good step would be a step backwards to look into, to revisit what exactly was agreed upon and who should be giving the guarantee to the implementation of it. The African Monitoring and Verification Team I think these are a group of 5 or 6 people on the ground who have boots on the ground in the Tigray region to monitor the DDR, the disarmament processes. These are the only ones, and even them did not so far produce a formal report yet. The Prime Minister was speaking to the National Parliament just this week or last week, and he clearly said to the National Parliament that Pretoria was signed between the federal government and 3 men. 3 men who have now are on his side, who have had the fragmentation in the Tigray regional state and have come to the center and have established a new political party and an armed wing that is also attempting to battle the TPLF forces on the ground. So there is a clear indication of arming insurgent groups with the intention of weakening the TDF or the Tigray interim administration from the federal government side. So these are clearly not part of the provisions of the Pretoria Agreement. So I think a good step would be the step back and reevaluating what is to be delivered when, what is the issue of accountability, what is the issue of disarmament, reintegration, and the return of the IDPs. It has become a political pawn nowadays between the authorities in Mekelle and in Addis, especially in Addis. What is responding to the Tigray's pre-war status mean? Because that is also being spelled in the Pretoria Agreement. So there's no follow-up whatsoever. What does it mean when the Ethiopian Electoral Board automatically cancelled or disqualified the TPLF, which is one of the signatories of this process, as an illegitimate political party, having it trapped into this bureaucratic attrition instead of a political discussion for whatever accountability mechanisms that need to be happened within the TPLF. What does it mean when the electoral board cancels and liquidates the existence of a political party, which is a party to the agreement itself, right? And so I think a good step for the US, for the UN, for the African Union, for the IGAD and everything is to take a step back and establish and create a mechanism in which each of them could be a guarantee to the different aspects of the Pretoria Agreement, with accountability and with a chain of command of when to be, what is to respond to whom, and when is that going to be responded. I think that's the best way. Pretoria cannot be shredded into non-existence for all its fault lines. It has, yes, silence it against, and we cannot take that for granted. It would be really foolish to take that for granted, but capitalize on that one by revisiting its deliverability, accountability, and who is really trespassing the provisions there.
So taking a step back, Mike, what do you think the best way Washington can help create a sustainable peace?
Look, I mean, there are a number of things that could be done. I mean, certainly the point I had made earlier about reactivating that kind of diplomatic coalition, right, that involved key African actors in the United States, even as the U.S. kind of manages these extra-regional actors, I think could be quite important. But I think there's a big question. I mean, there's a big policy question for the U.S. that I think it faces in Ethiopia, and it's faced at recurring junctures, right? Ethiopia is a big, very important, consequential country in the region, right? It's historically been an anchor of U.S. diplomatic engagement, East Africa and the Horn. It's been a conduit of a lot of security engagement across the region, including in terms of counterterrorism in Somalia. And the policy question is, how central will consolidating Pretoria be in the bilateral dialogue between the United States and Ethiopia, right? Because one could imagine a world, particularly with the new administration, where Pretoria internal governance related questions are kind of moved to the side in an effort to sort of rehabilitate the diplomatic relationship that was damaged, right, between Ethiopia and the United States during the Tigray War. And so it's not clear to me what the orientation of this new administration is going to be on that particular question. Because if Pretoria, peace and security in northern Ethiopia is not central to the bilateral relationship right now, then I think it's gonna be hard to do anything to really move things forward. So and the other thing I should say is that commercial engagement is important for this administration, and that's also a consideration when we look at U.S.-Ethiopia relations, particularly in the aviation sector. So I think I would just put that on the table.
Peyton, I wonder what you think of that. It is a little bit hard to know what the priorities of a President Trump would be when it comes to being offered options for what to do next in Ethiopia. But we do know that in other occasions, even with Russia, Ukraine, Mike was just saying that there's an interest in business and commercial operations. The president has very clearly prioritized peace, has prioritized another tick on his arguments for the Nobel Peace Prize than anything else. So I wonder if you think at this point there is an argument to the president to be made that would tap into his very, very clear public desire to have, I solved that one, I solved that one. Well, give me another one I can solve.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't presume, having for a number of reasons, but including that I was a Biden appointee, I wouldn't presume to know how best to persuade President Trump to engage on something. But I will say this, Nick, there was a very interesting letter a few weeks ago that I think was subsequently leaked or made public from the Ethiopian foreign minister to the UN Secretary General. And part of that was expressing concern about what obviously Addis Ababa perceives as Eritrea's malign activities inside Ethiopia. But there was a section in that letter that professed a desire for a broader discussion on commercial connectivity in the region, on economic integration and cooperation, infrastructure, et cetera. And, we've seen from the Great Lakes, for example, and you mentioned even Ukraine and minerals, this does appear from the outside to be an administration that is very interested in business, and it is interested in commercial, has commercial interests and promoting both American interests, but also, leveraging commercial and business interests for stability and for, as they define it, to promote peace. And I do wonder, in the context of not just with regards to Ethiopia and Eritrea, but more broadly, and there's been discussions on this for some years, frankly, about the need for greater economic integration in the Horn of Africa as a means of at least containing some of the interstate conflicts that then tend to become intrastate conflicts. And I do wonder if this is an administration that is predisposed to embrace something along those lines and to take the opportunity of what the Ethiopian foreign minister, and again, others have proposed, as a part, not a silver bullet for any of the problems that we're discussing. There are plenty of other, issues that need to be dealt with. But if it couldn't be a component of an overall strategy to promote de-escalation in the first instance, to sort of ease tensions a bit, to reinforce, as I was saying earlier, the respect among the states in the region for each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity and their borders, and ultimately to head off some of the more dire contingencies we've been discussing. So, I think it is possible to sort of build on that. It's, some version of this has been an element of what the president and his special envoy Mossad Boulos and others are attempting in the Great Lakes, as I mentioned, and folks will be aware of. It's perhaps too soon to tell whether that will bear fruit. But my view is, this is a time to be creative, right? And to explore any range of options that could contribute to stabilizing the situation. So I think that's absolutely should be a part of the discussion.
Denali, what do you think about that? You talked in our previous round about what Washington should do about stepping back, but is there a de-escalation version that the Trump administration could pursue alongside the EU and AU in order to at least stop the momentum toward this nightmare scenario that you guys imagined could come in the future?
Question for me, Nick?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, sorry. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, during the first outbreak of the war, the US was not only uninterested, but also, I guess, taking a side in support of the prime minister. when we see in the initial phases at least, or until the Biden administration was sworn in. And that has left a scar of its own. And now with the US, the current US administration's disengagement in the political affairs of the Horn of Africa, and by and large, I think Mike would be much more positioned to answer this. But that doesn't mean that there are not things to be done to de-escalate. I believe the special envoy is about to visit, to come to the Horn of Africa, and I'm informed that he would be traveling both to Addis and to Asmara. It doesn't mean that diplomatic leverages are completely out of the equation. I think there is still several leverage that the US can do in terms of commercial and economic benefits. I think they are, in fact, more interested in supporting the Ethiopian Airlines' endeavor to build a multi-billion-dollar new airline not far from the capital, Addis Ababa. And without a durable peace, that cannot be something that the US could get involved in that. And having a durable peace means, first and foremost, resolving the multiple internal crises that Ethiopia is experiencing today, be it in Amhara region or in Oromia or elsewhere, and leveraging diplomatic efforts for the Abiy's administration to solve these problems through dialogue, because right now everybody's focused on a military zero-sum game. So I think there is still some leftover leverage diplomatically from the US government. But most importantly, it has to be a transatlantic effort. I think a transatlantic effort was somehow crucial in forcing all parties to come to the Pretoria Agreement, although battleground realities have also forced both sides to come to the negotiation table. So I think the transatlantic efforts, the US cannot push for this one alone. So the best course to follow through is to have the transatlantic coalition again and leverage whatever diplomatic mechanisms are, instruments are there. And I think it's not over. It can still be pursued. Nick.
That's a quite positive last line there. Mike, why don't you take have the last say here? Do you see the possibility of transatlantic leftover leverage, I think, as Tadala put it, and can that be effective?
Sure. I mean, obviously, if you can coordinate a transatlantic position on Ethiopia on broader Horn questions, I think that would be helpful. I think in the past, we have seen some coordination, but also notable differences. I think there were gaps between the United States and the various European partners on sort of their approaches to the Tigray conflict. Certainly, once we got to the Pretoria talks, the Europeans and the EU in particular were kind of marginalized in that entire process. But look, I mean, stepping back from this, I think, there are a lot of different proposals one could put on the table with respect to international engagement. I think there is a lot of scope for international engagement and sort of facilitation of dialogue, particularly between Eritrea and Ethiopia, because this is effectively an international dispute, right, at this point. I think on the Tigray question and broader internal conflicts in Ethiopia, it's a more complicated matter, in part because I think the Ethiopian government, from their perspective, I mean, their overall feeling is they don't really want to internationalize these conflicts, right? I think they've seen, for instance, international involvement and attention in the Tigray conflict in the past as being a problem, right? So one has to think of models of international engagement that are also going to be acceptable, right, to the Ethiopian government, right? Because they don't want too many international parties really in the mix, right, of the engagement between themselves and other domestic actors. So that's like a hurdle, I think, that's going to have to be overcome.
Interesting. All right, we bang on 10:30. Look at that. It's almost like we planned it. So we're going to shift to the question and answers section here. We've gotten quite a few. Thank you. We'll try and get to a number, and my colleagues here are helping me sift through these. One of the in the question and answers has been that we've done a little bit of symptom analysis and not enough on root causes. So for fear of opening up its own lecture, Tadala, can you take us through very briefly what you think some of the root causes are here? You've touched on this throughout your answers, but just to make sure that we, as part of this conversation, we acknowledge the root causes, before we get to either the solutions or kind of the status of things in the present. So just take us through what you see as some of the root causes to how we got here, very briefly, please.
Well, yeah, well, it's been 5 years, and what happened since the Pretoria could make this issue completely get lost in the details. But I think in one phrase, the root causes is political, right? And in the simplest form of it. But and the more complicated aspect of it is, I think it is the way in which the Prime Minister wanted to reconfigure the Ethiopian state and its identity. And the roles that the TPLF played in 1991 during the last reconfiguration of the Ethiopian state and the governance mode, the constitution, the federation, the state identity itself. And Abiy wanted to reconfigure that completely. And when the TPLF-led EPRDF regime collapsed under the pressure of popular protest and uprising, when they went to the Tigray region, then the physical distance became also the political distance between the two parties. And there was less and less reason for the two of them to discuss and have a common understanding, because the vision both have for the identity and nature of the Ethiopian state cannot be reconciled. So ultimately it boils down to the political. This is the politics, but also it's the way the Prime Minister wanted to reconfigure the Ethiopian state, which didn't sit, particularly the one aspect that the Tigray people and the TPLF espouses throughout its existence is the right to self-administer. And if you trace back to the chronologies of the outbreak of the war, it happened just 2 months after Tigray unilaterally held an election for the local council, which didn't sit well with the central government led by Abiy Ahmed. And then they get into this mutual delegitimization politically from both sides, because the Abiy regime did not want to have election at that time. And so that has then added fuel to the differences of visions and for the identity and the nature of the Ethiopian state that both of them had. So, but ultimately, in the simplest form of it, it is political, but deeply, if you look into it, it is a difference of vision for how they wanted to, envision the Ethiopian state to look like. What is the place of Tigray in the Ethiopian state under the Prime Minister's vision of centralizing power? So if you look into those aspects, you get into the more complicated differences of that. But ultimately, it is a difference that cannot be overcome through a good faith negotiation between both parties, which doesn't exist and continue to exacerbate the difference. Hence, Nick.
Excellent. That was excellent. Thank you. All right, Mike, we've covered this question a little bit, a few times throughout, but we've gotten quite a few on the international aspects of this. And so let me just ask this version of this: how should it how to interlink the situation in Sudan and stability in Tigray and Ethiopia in general? It's been mentioned, and of course, as we're all following, the eruption of the RSF seizing El Fasher in Darfur and the horrors that I think we still only know just a little bit of. But the question is, considering the expected, quote, second round of conflict as the RSF is moving forward in Darfur. So the question is about interlinking the situation in Sudan and Tigray and Ethiopia in general.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are a lot of different ways to approach it. I mean, I think we've already discussed some of the risks of the merging of those two particular conflicts. And one other thing I'll add, just to make the point more explicit. I mean, Tsadala, I think, had talked about the need to kind of arrest historic cycles of impunity in Ethiopia, but there's also a regional dimension to this, right? I mean, this is a neighborhood, and actors look into their neighbors to sort of understand sort of trends in international politics, what's possible. And when you see the kind of array of atrocities that we've seen in Sudan and El Fasher and elsewhere, I mean, I think that also that creates a world in which in neighboring countries, similar atrocities might be possible, or the use of force, or the breaking of all kinds of norms around IHL. So I think we need to think beyond the kind of mechanics of who's allied with who across borders. We also need to think about those kinds of linkages in terms of connections between the Sudanese and the Ethiopian theater. But I think the connections, look, obviously, if you can stabilize Sudan, I think that's going to do something, obviously, to reduce the risks of a conflict in Ethiopia and vice versa. But I think this is also, we also need to think about this with respect to the regional actors, the broader extra-regional actors, because I think they think of the Horn as a region, and they're looking at their interests across multiple spaces. So I think a compact on Sudan between, the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Emiratis, a political settlement there might also have implications and make certain considerations about how they think about Ethiopia, for instance, right? And so you could, so a settlement in Sudan might have elements of a settlement or a compact on Ethiopia or Somalia, et cetera, right? Because from the perspective of the Gulf countries and Turkey, they see all of these spaces as linked. Now, that's not a super specific answer, but I think those are the kinds of linkages we should be thinking about.
Peyton, I'll direct this next one to you. How will Ethiopia's upcoming elections, scheduled for June 2026, affect how the Ethiopian government approaches internal conflicts and even potential conflict with Eritrea? How should diplomats leverage that election to highlight worsening security and civil society situations in the country?
Well, look, Tadala and Mike, I think, will also have very incisive views on this. So I hope they come in. I mean, I would just say, without probably getting too into the specifics of this, elections tend to be, well, let me say it differently. Elections don't tend to be de-escalatory events. So I think, by and large, right, they have sort of unique history in Ethiopia and I guess in individual countries, but I do think it's something that it's an important question to raise. I think it further challenges us to see what can be done between now and the elections to take some of the flashpoints that have emerged in the course of the discussion we've been having today off the board, right? Because there are risks inherent in any elections that occur in volatile and unstable environments, whether you're talking about a domestic context or the broader regional context. So again, others here on the panel will have, I think, more granular views in terms of the intricacies of Ethiopian political dynamics around that. But I think it's another element of what at least I have, and I think we all share, at risk of putting words in Mike's and Tadala's mouth, the sort of sense of urgency of trying to set the country and the region on a more stable trajectory, because of it, whether it's elections or something else, other things are always going to come down the pipe that can further fuel some of the elements of destabilization that I think so concern all of us here today.
If you guys want to jump in, feel free. Just do it quickly because I want to try and get through as many questions as possible.
No, I mean, I would just
Oh, sorry.
go ahead, Sadala, go ahead.
I just wanted to say this is an important question, but I think Ethiopia has passed the point where elections do matter. We were pretty much excited about the past election because that was the first election Ethiopia was about to have after the coming into power of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and everybody had an expectation that it was going to be some sort of an election that could see a transition to a democratic process. But what instead happened was an election that did not even cover the entirety of the Ethiopian constituencies there. Tigray was absolutely missing, continued to be missing from the national parliament, 36 seats, and also from the upper house. And the last election did not happen in half of the Oromia region, which is the largest regional state, entirely in Gambela region, and also parts of Benshangul and in Somali Afar. So we had an election that was not complete enough in its sense. And the parliament was sworn in, and we got into, in fact, worse situation. That election was telegraphed as being like the most decisive election to usher in peace and stability in Ethiopia. What we have seen, and I think I wrote at that time for New York Times even, that this election is going to exacerbate Ethiopia's crisis. And it's exactly what it did. So I think Ethiopia's crisis today is beyond what an election could sort, if you look into it, because we will be having even less constituencies covered this time, as opposed to the last one. As opposed to half of Oromia, I think majority of the Oromia regional state could be inaccessible for electoral authorities to conduct a peaceful and fair election. Amhara region is entirely engulfed by the ongoing war, which the government again said was going to take just 2 weeks to resolve. But we have now entering the third year, and there's no indication that the government is taking this conflict seriously to have a dialogue and to have a peaceful resolution to it. The prime minister branded it as a destabilization by a few, I don't know, road robbers or something like this. So there is the lack of seriousness. So the entire Amhara region is engulfed with that kind of crisis. So what does election mean in this circumstance? We don't know if the electoral authority is ready to have the Tigray region participate in the election so that it could be reintegrated back to the federation. So I think Ethiopia's crisis is past an election can solve at this moment. Over to you, Mike.
I mean,
Quickly.
I agree with the points that have been made. The only other point I would add is really a kind of the historical one, which is one of the major accelerants of the conflict between the TPLF and the federal government in 2020 was disputes over elections, right? And so that's a warning sign, I think, as we move forward to upcoming elections. And the way I see it, at this point, it's quite unlikely you're going to have elections conducted in Tigray, and so you're going to have, again, a state of exception, as it was called by Tzedale, basically a interim administration in Tigray of sort of questionable, perhaps legal standing, and that's kind of an unsustainable situation, I think going forward. So I think, again, I'm quite concerned about all of that.
Peyton, let me go to a different topic from the questions. I'm going to combine a couple here. Peyton, can you speak to the role USAID played ahead of Pretoria, including the implementation of Pretoria, and where does the shuttering of USAID, or how does the shuttering of USAID affect any further efforts in the diplomatic space, but also, of course, just providing the assistance that so many IDPs need as well?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Nick, I don't have the numbers in front of me to answer that with the level of precision that I would like to, but unquestionably, the shocks across, I mean, it's not news to anybody listening in today, I assume, but the shocks across the global humanitarian and development system caused by the Trump administration's destruction of USAID are incalculable. And that is certainly true in somewhere like Ethiopia, right? Each country obviously has its own kind of history and relationship with USAID and with US foreign aid more broadly. But it's certainly, whether it's even when you look at the issue of IDPs or refugee resettlement back into Tigray, I mean, these large UN agencies that would have to be called upon to facilitate any of those returns have been deeply damaged by the foreign aid cuts that the Trump administration has enacted. So that's, of course, not limited to Tigray, it's not limited to Ethiopia, but it certainly has had an impact. In terms of implementation of the COHA, of the Pretoria Agreement, I maybe will just say one thing, which is that I was shocked at the time in how slow the international system broadly, inclusive but not limited to USAID, was in terms of responding to the humanitarian conditions that existed in Tigray when the Pretoria Agreement went into effect. As I think was said at the beginning of the discussion, the Tigrayan people had, of course, endured tremendous suffering in the course of the war, and very limited, with a couple of windows of exception, very limited access for USAID and its partners, for other donors and their partners, for the United Nations into Tigray to attempt to mitigate or alleviate that suffering. And then when access actually to Tigray was opened, the international community, and this predated, in full fairness, certainly what's happened to USAID under the Trump administration, the international community, in my view, is very, very slow to seize the opportunity of that access to then respond to the enormous needs at scale and as expediently as one would have hoped. And I think that it was a tremendous disappointment for me, but never mind for the Tigrayan people, and something that I think we should not lose sight of, and hopefully is not repeated. I think there's also a great need to think about in this aid environment, again, not just because of USAID, but other donors, major donors are cutting their foreign aid budgets significantly across the world. If we were to have the sort of nightmare scenario that we're talking about, the likelihood of a humanitarian response at scale, irrespective of the security and political conditions, is not very high. And so that also, I think, is a sobering reminder of what the human cost could be of war, were it to erupt.
Yeah, fascinating. Tadali, a question for you that actually relates to that, and especially with IDPs. The question is, you mentioned IDPs being used as a political pawn. Who is responsible for implementing the return of IDPs as outlined in Pretoria? Is it ultimately the Ethiopian federal government's job to enforce that? And why then has no progress been made on that front?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. That's one of the really key sticking points that is creating a lot of tension at the moment. Technically, the Pretoria Agreement has it that the withdrawal of foreign forces that are occupying parts of Tigray today was the responsibility of the federal government. Article 10 of the Pretoria Agreement insists that the disarmament of Tigrayan forces need to happen concurrently with the withdrawal of foreign forces. It mentioned their foreign forces because Eritrea could not have been mentioned at that time, but also the Amhara militia that are controlling western parts of Tigray, and this is an area where one of the most egregious ethnic cleansing and deportation by force took place, according to even the report by the State Department. So technically speaking, the federal government was responsible to oversee the return of the IDPs, which means that the federal government need to oversee the withdrawal of foreign forces from the Tigrayan territory, and that would see also the Tigrayan territory restored to the pre-war status. IDPs could not be returned so far because these areas still continue to be controlled by both the Eritrean forces. I think even though there are some different aspects there, but particularly the western part of Tigray. There have been an attempt with the local authorities in the past. They have tried to relocate the IDPs to these areas, but the security of the area is still under control of the same forces, the same actors that are accused of committing that egregious ethnic cleansing. For example, Colonel Demaka, who has been named by the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International as being the perpetrators of the ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray, is still administering the area with the support of the federal government. So this has complicated the return. And the Tigrayan authorities insist that the administration of these areas must be secured first so that the security of the people that are returning to their areas could be safe. As they have seen it in the past 3-4 times, there was a redisplacement of these victims of IDPs by relocating them there without having security clearance, without having their areas being administered in a safe way, and with still having those officials accused of committing those ethnic cleansing crimes still in charge with the support of the Amhara regional government and also the federal government. So that has complicated further the process of returning the IDPs. And the TPLF doesn't see a safe passage while this arrangement continues and the status quo still has not been returned according to the Pretoria Agreement. They don't see returning the IDPs. They see that will again expose them to further vulnerabilities than even they have seen it. And experience tells them the same. They have done that 3 times and the people were redisplaced again. We've been reporting on that one. So I think the key sticking point here is the federal government's inability or unwillingness to be able to restore the areas under the Tigrayan administration and have elections take place there so the people could elect whichever way they wanted to elect. So the failure to implement those issues, especially withdrawal of those foreign forces, has prevented the return of IDPs, and that has in return created the political tension that we're seeing today.
Question, I think. Mike, do you want to jump in? Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, just that was, I think, a great analysis. Maybe 2 other points. This is also, I mean, the territory that's under dispute is also highly strategic, right? I mean, it sits at basically the nexus of the Eritrean, Ethiopian, Sudanese frontiers. And one of the reasons that territory was occupied, there was a priority on occupying that territory fairly early on by the Ethiopian government's coalition forces, was because it basically blocked the TPLF's access to Sudan. So there is that strategic, I think, consideration and some underlying economic interests at stake there as well in terms of highly valuable cash crops and so forth. So there's a whole political economy of conflict in that region. I think that is important. Those are just the two things I want to put on the table.
And in fact, that's a segue to the next question that I was going to direct at you, Mike. What role is the illicit economy in the region in mining and trafficking playing in tensions within the Tigray leadership and relations with Eritrea and the federal government?
It's hard to say. I mean, the intel again on this issue is a bit hazy. I think Chatham House has produced a couple of good reports on kind of the political economy of conflict, particularly in Northwest Tigray and then Western Tigray as well. Look, I think that, and I want to be careful in sort of how I frame this, but I think one analysis or one view has been that part of the rupture within the TPLF was in part a question of control of natural resource wealth, and particularly the illicit gold trade, some of which was moving through Eritrea and became a kind of glue between certain TPLF figures, generals, and the Eritrean government, but was also moving through Sudan, right? So that is seen as, I think some have viewed this as being, kind of one vector of tension within the TPLF, and then one kind of connective tissue between the TPLF and the Eritrean government. And then I've already mentioned kind of cash crops, the kind of control the cash crop economy that's relevant in Western Tigray, particularly things like sesame and so forth. So I think that's sort of how I see it. But that's really kind of hazy, and we're in the realm of kind of allegations and counterclaims and all the rest of it.
Tsadale, and I acknowledge I'm running out of time here. Question for you. We've observed the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. Since then, research has confirmed the meaningful participation of women in negotiation and implementation of peace greatly improves the sustainability of that peace. How involved were local women in the Pretoria Agreement, and how are the voices of women being heard in implementation of the agreement now?
This is I thought I was muted. This is a very important question, Nick, and it's one of the most tragic aspects of the Pretoria Agreement, but also during the war's connect. I'm not saying this because I'm a woman. I'm saying this because women in the Tigray region were the utmost victims of this war. We were reading a report last week produced by the local commission of the Tigray genocide, and the numbers are even by far higher than what we already knew. Given that the war has made women's body the battleground, including sexual slavery, the reports are very, very gruesome for me to outline here. We've been living through that. Women were absolutely not represented, both during the Pretoria Peace Agreement, but also after. This is one aspect, and it's a very tragic aspect of that. Number two, I think the bigger picture is that there were a number of civil society organizations, women-centered civil society organizations, who tragically supported the war. And that has created a fissure, supported the war in one way or another, or looked the other way when this egregious crime against women were happening. And that has created a fissure of itself. The connection between the civil society, women-centered civil society in Tigray and in Addis is non-existent. What little existed before was completely severed, as any part of Ethiopian civil society, Ethiopian fabric that this war has affected. This is one area that it affects. There was no coordination to have Tigrayan women represented in the negotiation. There was no support from the stronger women-centered civil society organizations in Addis to support the women of Tigray to participate in the process. So this is really one of the most shameful aspects of the Pretoria Agreement, but also shameful aspect of the Tigrayan authorities in the ground in Mekelle to have never given this aspect and involved women, although there were a few of them in the political aspect of it. This is a completely neglected area. So as important as the women participation, in fact, the first person who tried to mediate when the war broke out was a woman, was Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, right? So there was an active participation of women, interest in ending the war. but it didn't come to, and it's still the same. And it's a very shameful chapter of Pretoria and shameful chapter of post-Pretoria. And we're still living that one, and there is no representation whatsoever. So as honoring this aspect of the UN in terms of recognizing women and peace in this context, the Tigrayan women are absolutely absent. And it's very shameful.
We are running out of time, and we've tried to get to as many questions as possible. I apologize already for missing some of them. And so at risk of leaving us with an optimistic note, Peyton, let me just come back to you. You know, we talked about the nightmare scenario moving forward, but you also said that you thought war is not inevitable. And so why don't you just end our panel here with that point and reemphasize that and why you think that is.
Yeah, you know, Nick, I had the enormous pleasure during President Obama's administration to work for Senator George Mitchell when he was the president's envoy for the Middle East. And Senator Mitchell used to say that war, just as wars were fought by human beings, they are ended by human beings. And I would add the corollary to that, so the Mitchell rule, of they can be prevented by human beings. And the fact of the matter is, as we've discussed very openly today, there is no shortage of risk. And I couldn't agree more with Sadele, a comment that Sadele made earlier, which is that, you know, one errant bullet, one soldier doing something reckless in this environment could have outsized consequences. But that is not an alibi for the political leadership on all sides to or license for them to make bad choices. And there is still ample room to make good choices to prevent the worst outcomes. And I hope that that is what we see. I hope we see, as we've discussed today, a redoubled international diplomatic effort to encourage choices that are sober-minded and put both Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the broader region on a more stable trajectory. And I absolutely do not think it is too late for that. And I hope it's something that we see in the coming period, because it's certainly in the interest of the region. I also continue to believe it's in the interest of the United States to not see a broader conflagration emerge.
Well, with that, I will give everybody still online your final minute back before 11 o'clock. And with great thanks to our fabulous panel, Peyton Knopf, thank you so much. Mike Woldemariam, thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you all online have enjoyed it as well. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you.